The latest PWC Europe, Middle East and Africa Private Business Attractiveness Index has put South Africa in 23rd spot out of 33 countries. This is a slight improvement from 2021 and 2022, when the country ranked 31st and 25th respectively. The Business Attractive Index reflects positively on social and governance factors such as gender equality, press freedom and trust in government within the Europe, Middle East and Africa EMEA region. South Africa is being looked at in a more favourable light as a location for private business. Joining us to give us more insight is Duncan Adriaans, PWC Africa private leader. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Duncan. So let's start off with some of those key factors that have resulted in South Africa being perceived as attractive somewhat.
No, thank you, and good afternoon and good evening to all your listeners, and thank you for the invitation. So it's a relative index in terms of how we look at various environments across various jurisdictions, whether it be in Africa, Middle East and Europe. And we rank those in relation to sort of 9 categories, of which macroeconomic, social factors are all sort of the areas that we look at. For South Africa, the reason why we've moved up the ranking is, it's a function of 2 things. One, there have been some elements of reform, albeit be a little bit slow. Those reforms have resulted in slight improvements in terms of us moving forward. But relative to other countries may have regressed as well, which have allowed us to move a little bit ahead of them in terms of being more attractive. So our attractiveness is a function of others being regressing, but also some areas where we have moved forward. The areas where we have moved forward is post-COVID. We, as South Africans, said, well, we've got to get our economy revitalized post-COVID. Let's how we can give it a bit of a kickstart. And some of the things that were rolled out were policy reform as well as some incentives. And one great example of that is the solar power energy that has been created in the form of renewables. We had 1,000 megawatts in 2021. We now have 5,200 megawatts at present. Just one example of some of those have moved. Some of them have worked favorably, and in some areas I do believe there's still lots of room for improvement as well.
Now, Duncan, South Africa has seen an improvement in the number of investors, such as venture capital and private equity firms located in the country. What factors contributed to this increase, and how does it impact the overall business environment?
Thank you so much. So how that really impacts the environment traditionally is, they provide a source of capital, venture capitalists and these investors. We've also seen family offices, large family offices being in Europe, investing in large opportunities. And if you think about the sectors in where they're investing is probably in areas where we see a little bit of disruption or where there's a particular need, such as load shedding. So the amount of renewable energy that's coming in some areas around fintech. I think there is still some, if one looks at the startup scale-up environment, we have a lot of great ideas in our country, and we're coming up with a lot of innovative ideas. How we commercialize those and how we take those to market is perhaps where some of the venture capitalists and some of the private equity firms see a huge opportunity at this point in time, especially in a market where financial institutions are relooking at how they provide credit, how they provide finance to private businesses, especially if you're a startup, scale up and coming up with a great idea, but not having necessarily the track record. And that's where private equity investors and venture capitalists are prepared to take some form of risk.
So let's look at something like security, Duncan. How important is security as a factor? And I ask this, let's draw comparisons to, South Africa as one of the crime capitals of the world. Let's look at a country like Ukraine that is continually being bombarded by Russia. So there's a measure of insecurity in those 2 areas. Now, how does the report at all look at some of these factors?
I think sort of indirectly it does look at that kind of stability within the report. I think we look at particular 9 factors. I think the fact that we don't have that much instability in Europe, for example, it's perhaps not one of the key elements. But where it does affect, it affects the macroeconomics in terms of its ability to produce, let's say, output in terms of the form of GDP. So that's how it's impacted. It also impacts people. It affects lives. It affects public health, whether people will be able to come to work. So I think these things are fairly important for a private business in thinking about, if I want to set up a structure or an entity, if there's instability or conflict or there's a lot of fractured environments in where we operate, that has a direct impact on any other business, whether it be private, whether it be a large corporate, in terms of, can my employees come to work? Are they able to work remotely? What is the health conditions? What are the health systems like? Are they compromised? So I think these things are all interlinked, intertwined, and interconnected in the bigger scheme of things.
Now, disruption is obviously one of those key factors when investors look at certain markets. So, again, when you look at the negatives versus the positives, I mean, you talk about venture capitalists, for instance. Are they as risk averse as larger corporates or larger holders of foreign direct investment, for instance?
Yeah, so it all depends on their particular mandate in terms of how those funds are to be deployed, and I think how those funds are to be deployed will determine what particular risk appetite would be. So it would be sort of incorrect of me to make a very general statement around venture capitalists, but they would be prepared to potentially take on a little bit more risks than a traditional finance house or a bank, which needs to have a high level of confidence or certainty in terms of your ability to be able to settle that debt or service that debt over a long time. So they will be prepared, but I wouldn't say it's a paintbrush approach to all of them in that particular regard.
Duncan, before we let you go, despite the improvement in rankings, the report does acknowledge that South Africa still faces challenges like electricity load shedding, skills shortages, high unemployment, crime, and so on. How are these challenges being addressed, and what further measures are needed to overcome them?
Yeah, so those are definitely structural issues that we have in our country, and I think that's where policymakers and government, and that's wonderful about this particular report. This report helps private businesses help understand what do we need to nurture and to grow, and at the same time, this report will help government and policymakers to understand, well, where are the areas that they need to improve, and I'm very mindful that we're in an election here, but some of these things is where government should think about how do we improve, and I think particularly around the ports and the harbours, making sure that we can get some of our deciduous fruit around. How do we liberate some of the markets, for example, around energy and open the grid or create a new grid for more energies to be done. So it requires a paradigm shift in the way we think about these things. But at the same time, I would say it also presents an opportunity for private businesses to sort of work side by side with the private sector in the form of public-private partnerships to address some of the critical challenges we have in our country and to take those forward and to solve them.
Adrian, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Duncan Adriaans, a PWC Africa private leader.